Okay, so for my friend Peter asked me to look at his Blackface deluxe reverb amp because he said it sounds horrible. And first play, I played on it, and yeah, it sounds horrible. Anyway, having a quick look at it, trying to see what might be wrong with it, and this is typical of what you get with some vintage amps, which is it looks really good. There's a lot of mostly original stuff here. These two caps have been changed. Not sure about these two. This is original. This is part of the tremolo circuit, so it doesn't really matter. There's been some sort of a repair here. These are not carbon comp resistors. They look like the correct values. So far so good. So far the amp looks pretty good. Interesting that whoever changed these did not change the bias filter capacitor over here. I don't know if you can see that. And but I'll show you what I did find. Here inside the cap pan, here's the culprit. People have said before, you know, what are you talking about overfiltering? The original specs on this amp were 16, 16, 16, 16. Here are two original 16 microfarad filters. By the way, this is the part of the amp you don't want to touch, where you'll get your shock. And here we have a typical repairman misguided repair replacement of a 47 mic main filter and a 47 mic screen filter. And what that does is it totally changes the feel of the amp. So instead of being sounding like a small wattage soft amp, it's now got a ton of filtering for the power section, which is sometimes okay if you want to play louder. But the screen, this is way over filtered, and this will make the amp sound kind of choked and brittle. Anyway, I'm going to play the amp for you, and then we'll swap that out. We'll probably have to look at the bias because it looks like someone's put 6L6s in it, and I bet you it's biased real cold too, which is another typical repair mistake that you see commonly done on older amps like this. Otherwise, the amp is really, really clean, and should be interesting to see what a difference that makes. Okay, so this is our over-filtered Blackface Deluxe, control treble 7, bass 10, volume 3. Has sort of a grainy sounding character. Here's the amp on 10. Lots of distortion, but not the pleasant kind, and the decay is really grainy. Okay, so we've already discharged our caps, and the filters in this case in a Fender amp, your typical Fender amp, are found under this lovely tin box cap pan. Got a lovely Fender and his, I've got a punch press, I want to make things with it. Just brilliant. We're going to fire up the soldering iron, we're going to remove that guy. Not sure what we're going to do with that guy yet. And then we're probably going to look at the bias, see if we can get this thing to sound a bit better. Five volts, 5 volts, 5 volts, 5 volts. That's what we want to see. We're ready to go. I only use American-made or European-made caps whenever possible. Main reason for this is because a few years ago the Chinese started making caps, and they made a whole bunch of bad ones, which are out there still floating around as surplus and stuff like that. So you want to avoid those. Done the ground side first. Now I'm going to cut my lead on the positive side. Polarity is totally important. If we got this wrong, this would actually explode when we powered it up. So we want to do this right. And we want to make sure that our hot lead is fairly short, doesn't come in contact with any part of the chassis other than its destination connection. And that's in there good and tight. Just reheat that connection. Make sure we have a good solid connection. So there we go. 47, 16, 16, 16. Let's hear what it sounds like now. Okay, so I haven't done anything except change that one filter cap that was the wrong value. Sounds a little bit better. Still bias is wrong, but it's got a nice growl to it now. Okay, so this is the trickier part of amp work, and the amp is now live, and we've got to put our negative to the chassis, and this is where the bias feeds in, so we're going to get a bias reading, and it's minus 49, which is pretty darn cold. Now I'm not even measuring current, I just know that this amp, number one, sounds like it doesn't like whatever the bias setting is, and also that number's pretty high up there. So what I'm doing here is I'm measuring the bias, the negative voltage, and turning the set screw on this amp, and believe it or not, I set these things by ear. Let's give it a quick play and see what it's doing. The other thing I would look at is look at the tubes to make sure they're not red plating, but this thing was so cold I'll bet you that that they aren't, and we'll go from there. So we've got minus 38, we're going to go down, 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 35. Okay, so we've set the bias to minus 35 as per the factory recommendation. Let's give that a listen. Okay, I've set the bias to minus 35 volts. Sounds way more like a Fender amp. A lot better on the decay, but still could sound better. Let's see what else we can come up with. Okay, here's the importance of playing things and listening to them. This cap was turned upside down, and the amp was still not sounding right to my ears, so I thought I should look at this because it looked like it was a new solder job, and it's a Taiwanese cap, but not only that, it's 75 microfarads, which is completely the wrong value. Should be 25 for this position. A lot of the graininess we were hearing is in the bass end, and this is adding some bass, so we're going to put the proper cap in and give her a proper listen. Okay, so here's a set of JJs from my Princeton, and I'm just going to pop these in, give them a listen. I suspect these will sound better right off the bat than these groove tubes. Funky things. This is a 6L6 that Groove Tubes marketed as a 6V6 substitute when there were no 6V6s available, and it's just an inexpensive Russian 6L6. So it's probably not happy in this amp, and put in these JJs, which are apparently also not a proper 6V6, but I think they've done a better job with them because I think they were developed to be a 6V6 substitute versus those which were simply labeled to try and sell people something. So let's just give this a listen. We haven't adjusted the bias at this point. It's still minus 35, the factory setting. And let's just hear how the decay sounds. What I'm listening for is, just like when you listen to studio reverbs and things like that, I'm listening for a smooth decay rather than a grainy decay. And that's going to give me a tone I'm happy with. Okay. It's still not a great sounding amp, but it definitely is sounding much, much, much better. So there you go. That's typical of what you find when you buy vintage amps. In fact, this happened to me so often, I actually stopped listening to amps before I bought them. I would just look at them like this. If all the components were there and they looked unmolested, I was willing to buy them because I knew I could dial them in properly. And this is exactly typical of what I've found in so many cases, which is some well-meaning technician has gone in there, biased it real cold, put in new tubes, and done some minor repairs, and in the case of filtering, has gone and used the biggest available filters in order to keep the amp quiet, thinking in technical terms they've improved the amp. And in fact, what they've done is they've choked up the amp and made it sound really terrible for guitar. So typically all you have to do is get out the factory schematic, get the thing back to stock specs all the way through, and go from there, and then you should be able to dial in the amp fairly easily and get a good tone. So classic vintage amp lesson in this one.